Sarah, would you like to say a few words to welcome your colleagues? Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. We would like to welcome you, as Dr. Concepcion said, to this 40th annual PAASE meeting and symposium. This is parallel session 8.3 on social, cultural, economic, and political sciences. We have 5 speakers this morning. We have Dr. Emil Bolongaita of Carnegie Mellon in Adelaide. We have Dr. Ramon Clarete of the UP School of Economics. We have Dr. Mahalea Rabago of the Ateneo University, Dr. Jeffrey Ducanes of Ateneo University as well, and myself.
In the lumen or in the context of the GI tract in the region.
Okay, our first speaker. So on to our, we have, as we said, we have 5 speakers. We'll have 2 speakers first, Dr. Emiliano Bolongaita and Dr. Clarete, and then we'll have a 15-minute question and answer portion, after which we'll continue with our 3 other speakers and have another question and answer portion. After that, you may, if you have any questions, you can either post them orally, or you can also write them on the chat board. Now, or you can email them to 2020apams@gmail.com. Okay, so on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Emiliano Bolongaita, who is a distinguished service professor of public policy and management at Carnegie Mellon University and the head of Carnegie Mellon University, Australia. Prior to his appointment in 2013, Dr. Bolongaita held various senior roles in international development positions in the Asia-Pacific region. He was the unit head of the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, or CAREC, of the Asian Development Bank, and previous to this role, a public management specialist in the bank's South Asia Department. In his academic career, Dr. Bolongaita has taught at the Elliott School for International Studies at George Washington University, the National University of Singapore, and the Asian Institute of Management. He has written various academic papers on corruption and is co-editor and contributor of Challenging Corruption in Asia, Case Studies and a Framework for Action, published by the World Bank in 2004. Dr. Bolongaita received his PhD in Government and International Studies and Master's in International Peace Studies from the University of Notre Dame, Indiana, USA. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. Without further ado, please welcome warmly Dr. Bolongaita.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that overly generous introduction. I would like to thank as well Professor Concepcion for inviting me to be part of this panel. I am also delighted to be in the company of a very good friend, Dr. Ramon Clarete, and I'm very pleased to see also some of the former colleagues and who are among the audience in this panel. I note that former Secretary Pernia is joining us, and I would like to thank him for introducing and nominating me to PAASE. I would like to discuss in this talk the changes and challenges to public policy in the age of big tech, big data, and AI. This talk draws on ongoing research that I and my colleague Tima Lachlan are working on, which seeks to understand better the problems and opportunities faced by governments in their development and deployment of big data and AI solutions. We aim to contribute in a modest way to the discussion on the effectiveness of government's use of big data and AI solution to address society's problems in a more democratic manner. My talk will be divided roughly into 4 parts. First, I will talk about the rise of big data and AI, and with reference to how this has fostered big tech, which in turn generated more big data and AI solutions. Second, I will talk about government's response to big tech and government's own embrace of big data and AI, though not necessarily of big tech. And I will talk about some of the successful use of big data and AI solutions by governments, and then also talk about some of their failures. Third, I will present a preliminary analysis for these failures, focusing on the concept of social license and the risk of more failures if governments remain ill-equipped as big data and AI tools become more complex and ambitious. And lastly, I will offer some preliminary ideas about how governments can become more effective in building capacity and social license for their analytics and AI-driven programs. So first, about the rise of big data and AI. I think I state the obvious by talking about this topic. The explosion of structured and unstructured data is arguably the equivalent of the Big Bang. And the World Economic Forum estimates that our digital universe produced around 44 zettabytes as we entered 2020. And this is unsurprising, I suppose, given that 60% of the world's population are digitally active and increasingly more so. The structural drivers of big data growth are clear. The ubiquitousness of the smartphone as it becomes cheaper and more capable of computing power, the utility of the cloud, which amplifies computing power, and the analytical tools that make sense of big data, allowing for machine learning and deep learning. With the rise of big data, analytics has become an invaluable part of business intelligence. The research and advisory firm, Gartner, talks about 4 types of analytics capability. This is the so-called analytics continuum of descriptive analytics, diagnostic analytics, predictive analytics, and finally, prescriptive analytics, with each rung becoming more complex and deriving greater value for their users. Now, we are familiar with the technology firms that are skillfully harvesting, generating, and utilizing big data to develop their products and services and optimize their marketing and sales. The so-called GAFAM or GAFAM firms, top the list. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. With their trove of personal information, big tech are able to harvest and scoop up data for pinpoint marketing for greater returns, as well as pinpoint shaping of preferences to further bolster their own products and services to customers. What the sociologist Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. These big tech firms, fueled by big data, are becoming more and more powerful. And their business logic and business models have created problems that increasingly confront policymakers and regulators. Monopolistic powers that are deployed predatorily, severe information asymmetries between them and their customers and stakeholders, and negative externalities, such as the misuse and theft of personal data and the rise of disinformation. As some of you, or many of you, are quite well aware, The latter has notably embroiled Facebook, particularly in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which Facebook data were used by the political consulting firm to sow disinformation, to shape voters' preferences in elections in the US and elsewhere, notably including the Philippines. Before it was closed, Cambridge Analytica's website touted its support for a presidential candidate in the Philippines, promoting him as a strong, no-nonsense man of action. With its high internet penetration and heavy use of social media, the whistleblower of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Christopher Wiley, said that the Philippines was targeted by the firm because it was an ideal petri dish for the firm's tactics and techniques. The problems created and faced by big tech have compelled them to seek greater social license for their activities. The concept of social license emerged and gained credence in the mining industry, seen as a vital tool for building legitimacy for minerals extraction. I will use the definition by the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, which defines social license as the level of acceptance or approval granted to an organization's operations or projects by local community and stakeholders. Unquote. As such, social license constrains corporations, as one study puts it, to meet the expectations of society and to avoid activities that societies deem unacceptable. Arguably, as part of their efforts to gain social license, big tech firms have called for more regulation of the internet. Recently, the CEOs of Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple fronted a US congressional committee seeking to investigate their alleged violations of various laws, a hearing that will likely lead to more efforts at regulation of big tech and other technology firms. And mindful of the need for social license, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft have refused to make facial recognition software available to police departments until governments put in place relevant legislation. If big tech and other corporations' need for social license is clear for their data analytics activities, so do governments. No? More so, given that governments have a more complex relationship with their citizens than corporations do with their customers. No? As Henry Mintzberg described it, governments do not just treat citizens as such, no? Who in a democracy elect officials to run governments, but they also treat citizens as clients who avail of services of governments, as customers who buy goods and services from government, and finally, as subjects who have to obey laws and can be punished for the violations of those laws. In their role as agents of the public, governments have responded to complaints from their citizens and businesses to the behavior and practices of big tech, notably in terms of protection of privacy. Among this is the EU's General Data Protection Legislation, which mandate, among others, that personal data should not be processed unless certain conditions are met, namely transparency, legitimate purpose, and proportionality. While there have been critiques of the insufficient resources that EU governments have placed on the regulatory authorities responsible for GDPR enforcement, the EU and its constituent governments have been enforcing the regulation in many ways. In March of last year, notably, the European Commission fined Google 1.9 billion euros for abusive practices in online advertising. In their role of dealing with citizens as clients, customers, and as subjects, governments have followed in the footsteps of technology companies and embraced big data and AI. There's no question that big data and AI present significant utility for governments and the public sector, particularly for its internal operations and delivery of services. And governments have rapidly moved up the analytics chain, from descriptive to diagnostic analytics, and increasingly to predictive analytics. There is now a growing body of scholarship in the growth and expansion of algorithmic government. With relative success, governments are using descriptive and diagnostic analytics to improve operational efficiency and delivery of government services. In Australia, for example, where I am located, government is using data science in streamlining business operation across many sectors, from tax collection to social welfare services and public health. With analytics, government agencies are able to manage demand more effectively and deploy resources more efficiently. In certain areas, governments, including here in Australia, have sought to gain greater value through predictive and prescriptive analytics, which is where increasingly they are facing the challenge of social license, which is compounding the technical difficulties brought about by the greater complexity of these tools. Predictive tools are now being deployed and used by various governments to address problems in the very sectors where they only previously used descriptive and diagnostic analytics, such as public health, social services, and law enforcement. The application of predictive analytics in these fields have led to problems and controversies. The failures in the use of governments of big data and AI have manifested themselves in a number of areas. For example, in Ireland, they had the cervical cancer screening scandal, which erupted in 2018, involving women who were given false negatives by the government's or the country's health service cervical check system. In Australia, its robo-debt recovery scheme, where the government sought to use machine learning to determine and recover excess welfare payments. The computer program checked the data between the welfare agency that issues the payments against the income they reported to the Australian Tax Office. At least 20% of the notices of debt were incorrect, as there were actually no debts, with errors affecting the most vulnerable Australians who had the greatest difficulty in responding to the errors. To date, more than 370,000 people were affected. And last month, the government announced that they would refund up to $721 million to Australian citizens. UK's Care.Data program, which was supposed to combine health and social care information across the National Health Service for the benefit of patient care. Anonymized data could be used by researchers to develop new treatments and assess performance of NHS services. However, there were concerns about the sharing of sensitive medical information with commercial companies without the explicit consent of patients, whose objections could be overturned. More than 1 million patients opted out. If governments are encountering big data failures in their role of treating citizens as customers and clients, they are facing more so in their treatment of the citizen as subjects, where it applies coercive powers. In the US, for example, which has the highest incarceration rate in the world and the biggest prison and jail population, big data is being used in predictive risk modeling for determining criminal sentencing and parole terms. As a decision support tool, predictive risk modeling methods have come a long way. We are now in the 4th generation tools, most notably the US COMPASS system. COMPASS, which stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. This machine learning program that aims to predict risk and recidivism has found to be biased heavily against blacks, which may help to explain this phenomenon of Black Lives Matter. One study known that showed that black defendants were often predicted to be at a higher risk of recidivism than they actually were. Black defendants who did not recidivate over a 2-year period were nearly twice as likely to be misclassified as higher risk compared to their white counterparts, 45% versus 23%. While white defendants were often predicted to be less risky than they were. White defendants who reoffended within the next 2 years were mistakenly labeled low risk almost twice as often as black reoffenders, 48% versus 28%. It is important to note the critical context in which governments are mobilizing and failing in their use of big data and AI solutions. There is worldwide falling trust in government by their citizens, while citizens have greater access to information through the internet, even as they demand more responsiveness from and participation in government activities. This cursory review of the failures of government in their use of big data tools as they move up the analytics continuum indicate that the failures stem from a combination of technical, managerial, political, and no less important, social failures. The technical problems in data mining and machine learning are compounded by poor data management and communication failures between the developers of tools and their political overseers, in great part due to the limited interest or ability of these officials to grasp technical issues. This has led to inadequate social license that help to dismantle instead of repairing and improving analytic solutions when they encountered problems. This was the case for Australia's RoboDebt program. This was the case for UK's Care.Data program and many others. A different problem may arise where social license may be sound and relatively effective, but technical performance could undermine the government's efforts to deploy the analytic solution. For example, Australia's COVID-safe app, designed for contact tracing in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, has managed to exceed the government's target of 40% of residents' uptake. And yet, it has, in a recent study, been found to be technically deficient. It turns out that the Bluetooth handshake over which the app depends on are hindered if iPhone screens are locked. Now, the technical and social challenges to analytic solutions are likely to become greater as tools become more sophisticated. Explaining the tool and making it less opaque become greater the more complex the tool. And this is clearly the case with predictive analytic tools such as Compass, as previously described, a tool that looks at over 137 variables. Now, government's vulnerability in its deployment of big data and AI solution rests in great part on the opacity of these tools and the lack of transparency about the technical aspects and the algorithmic formulas and values of the analytical tools themselves, as well as the development process and the planning for the use of these tools. This transparency problem is compounded by information asymmetries, as big data and AI generate more information for government about their citizens without a corresponding increase in the citizens' knowledge of the workings of their government. Current mechanisms of political participation, which rests on representative government, offer limited capacity for citizens for collective action and limited ability of governments to create mechanisms that generate feedback. It is increasingly evident that addressing the problem of transparency cannot be effectively done by traditional government institutions and their conventional processes. Issues are moving too fast for policymakers and regulators to respond before damage is done. The creation of algorithmic tools are also occurring at a rapid pace. And the breadth of participation required for consultation can no longer be contained by dealing with the usual interest groups. Let me now sum up my talk as follows. Big data and AI present significant opportunities as well as serious challenges to governments and for democratic governance. Big data and AI can give governments greater capacity through descriptive, diagnostic, and predictive analytics. But as governments seek to derive greater value from increasingly complex tools up the analytics continuum, it will face increasing technical, managerial, political, and social challenges. Hence, even as governments seek to develop and deploy analytic tools to address problems at scale, they must also scale up the capacity of their own staff in the civil service to understand the nature of algorithmic solutions and the peculiar challenges to their deployment. This is necessary not just for government's capacity to deliver their own big data and AI solutions, but also to better equip governments to deal with corporations and organizations operating in the political and policy arenas that are themselves utilizing big data and AI solutions. Thank you.
Thank you for that very informative talk, Dr. Bolongaita.